Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of Unit 7, right? So we are picking up where we left off a long time ago, right? All the way back before break when we were discussing the rise of Darwinism, how evolution is going to forever change society, especially starting out in Europe, and how it's going to also begin to permeate its teachings, ideas, and really kind of mess with understanding about the world, science, humanity, where we came from, and everything else far outside of Europe for decades and centuries to come, right? Now, the thing about it, though, that I do want to go ahead and throw out there is I did send y'all an email, right, telling you when your next test will be. It's going to be the Friday after we come back, all right? So we're going to have a Monday class, a Wednesday class, and we don't have that much more to learn, all right? We literally have two concepts left to learn, okay? And it's not going to be a big rush, and we're going to get that stuff wrapped up. It's not a big deal. But what I am going to do to help you out a little bit is I'm going to post a series of Heimler videos just so you can kind of start restudying a little bit, right? So before you actually get into the point where you start studying your study guide, which I will post on Monday, before you start getting into that point, watch those Heimler videos to give yourself a nice little overview of the content that we've already talked about from Unit 7. And I will also post this Prezi to Google Classroom so you actually have something to look over and just kind of click your way through a little bit so you can get ready, okay? So just keep that in the back of your mind. That's a little update. Here we go, all right? Let's jump back into where we're talking about because I don't want to keep y'all any longer than I have to. This is the first flip coming back from break. I'd like to keep this bad boy under 15 minutes, and we only have 4 slides, right? So we left off talking about Charles Darwin, and what is going to happen after his voyages to the Galapagos Islands in the 1800s, specifically 1827. When he goes to the Galapagos Islands and begins to observe finches and tortoises and these crazy iguanas that are vegetarian that actually live underwater, they're pretty much like aquatic iguanas that eat moss underwater. It's crazy. So when he observes all these things, he actually begins to publish his findings into 2 different texts, right? He published his findings into 2 different books, one called The Origin of Species, where he outlines his ideas on evolution and the natural progression of the adaptability of animals and evolution in general, right? He then further outlines these ideas with Survival of the Fittest, Natural Selection, in a book called The Descent of Man, which is a terrible book. I'm telling you now, The Origin of Species is a groundbreaking scientific text where basically Darwin really breaks down and categorizes the concept of evolution. And then The Descent of Man, we start seeing how an old, really fuddy white guy from Europe starts trying to apply that stuff to society and other jacked up parts, right? For example, in The Descent of Man, he said that women are evolutionarily less involved than men. And he used peacocks as an example, which is ridiculous, right? So going into it, the ideas did advocate for evolution over time, right? And began to discuss the ideas of random chance mutations, even though the word mutation wasn't necessarily used, right? Not actively anyway. And it begins to kind of really go into the strongest survives, natural selection. And here's the thing that we have to understand. He did propose the idea that men evolved and human beings evolved, not men specifically, but human beings evolved from lesser forms of life, right? But specifically related mostly to apes and other types of primates is that he's going to relate it to. Now, there is going to be a big religious reaction to this, okay? So underneath religious reaction, this is something you shouldn't have to write a lot about because this seems pretty obvious, right? How would religious individuals, religious entities, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches even, during this time period react to the idea that the creation story is not true, right? They're going to freak out, all right? There's going to be a massive amount of religious backlash that's going to go along with this, and a lot of different authorities are going to refuse to accept his findings, even though they are scientifically pretty much fact. All right, so now going into it though, you have to understand what ends up happening after that religious backlash and after The Descent of Man comes out and after he starts saying all this other jacked up stuff about women and people of other races, a new concept arises where people took his ideas of scientific evolution and they began to apply it to society. And they began to use it in really screwed up, stupid ways, all right? What social Darwinism is a theory spawning from a twisting of his ideas, but he kind of actually started the ideas with The Descent of Man. Don't even get me started on that. Not something you need to know, just something I know that I feel like the world should know. So going into it though, you have to understand he begins to apply it to societies, right? He begins to apply it to why Europeans are the imperializer, not the imperialized, right? And we'll get to that in our next discussion because I love talking about that concept. We will discuss that in our next class, right? What imperialism means and what it is, right? Now he also begins to apply it to race and gender as well, okay? So this is a big issue, is that he's applying this to this science scientific principle to things that it does not necessarily apply to, right? Like, for example, the gender one, he tried to use that, oh, look at the peahen. The peahen is a female peacock, right? And a peacock is a male one. He's like, look at the peahen. It's brown and lame looking, but a peacock is really flamboyant and crazy awesome, blah, 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 blah. And he tried to use that as an example of why men are superior to women. Dumb. So that's an example of social Darwinism, right? And what we need to understand, though, is that this concept of social Darwinism eventually leads to the backlash and the rise of things like eugenics and Nazi fascist ideologies, right? And so this is going to actually pop up a little bit more as the years go on, getting closer into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, all right? And this also will then later on combine with that concept called the general will from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to really create a perfect storm of bad, all right? So just keep that in the back of your mind, that social Darwinism is a really big issue. And we'll talk about it a lot more when we get into imperialism, when we bring up Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, which is a poem that he wrote that is extremely racist, all right? But we'll get into all that stuff a little bit more, but you need to know that concept is going to show up, all right? So going into it, though, you have to understand that Darwin is an example of the age of what is referred to as progress and modernity, even though ironically enough, it feels like his ideas kind of, not the evolution ones, those were fine, but his ideas towards society really kind of held us back and were very unmodern, right? But going into it, what you have to understand, while I actually go back through this present real quick and find where we left off. Oh, wait, nope, went too far. So, like, you have to understand that we are getting into this concept that's very, very hard to explain, right? Basically, what we're going to end up talking about is how Darwin was one of the early tone setters for how science is going to begin to tackle problems in society in a very different way, right? So, and it's also going to begin to lead to ideas of people going like, well, do we really know anything for sure, right? So this is a lot like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. What we're moving into right now is very much mirrored in how the scientific revolution answered a lot of questions that people didn't know the answers to. Where the Earth was in the solar system, who moves around what, heliocentric versus geocentric, microscopes, gravity, all of that stuff, right? The Enlightenment will then come in and it will try to answer ideas about society that the scientific studies cannot answer, right? You can't do an experiment to try and figure out what the best type of government is because this includes the lives of thousands of people, right? So like now you have to understand that in an essence that happened once already, it's about to happen again, right? Because Darwin's ideas lead to a growth of a mess of new perspectives, right? Taking the God out of science in a big way, all right? So like now this is going to be a big deal going, oh my God, Prezi, come on now, stop being this way. There we go. We have to understand one of the biggest backlashes to Darwin's ideas is not even backlashes, one of the biggest movements in response to Darwin's ideas is going to be this actually trend called positivism. You can actually see this in people like Auguste Comte, who was an actual French philosopher of positivism. But what positivism means is that nothing is true unless science and math prove it, all right? So think about it in the way of I'm positive, right? I'm positive this is right. I'm positive this exists. I observed it. I know that this can will fall, right? So gravity must exist to an extent, okay? So we have to see it from that perspective. Now, this is going to be another threat to religion because religious institutions are going to backlash against this because they're going to be like, well, there are a lot of things that you can't necessarily prove using science, right? So this then leads to another kind of swinging of the pendulum back the other way. Remember that there are always push and pull factors, right? Whereas positivism began to push people in the direction of science and mathematics, another thing is going to pop up known as irrationalism, right? Now, irrationalism is a really important thing because basically these school of thought individuals said that nothing is accepted on faith alone and that every human is different and impulsive, right? So basically positivism is like you can only prove things with science and math. Irrationalists come in and they're like, well, what about things you can't prove with science and math? Like why the Enlightenment didn't work, right? So like that was a really big question that irrationalists brought up because they were like, remember, the Enlightenment was supposed to fix everything, right? The Enlightenment was this glorious moment where we looked at everything as an A plus B equals C kind of moment, right? That we looked at like the world and we were like the general will fix all, or the separation of government powers, Baron de Montesquieu, or just no fanaticism and acceptance of religious toleration, Voltaire, will fix all of our earthly problems, right? Well, the irrationalists looked at positivists and they were like, well, think about that. Positivists, did they prove anything? Because everything's still kind of bad, right? So in essence, nothing makes sense and it never will, all right, is what irrationalists actually came out. Because this flies in the face of that Enlightenment philosophy of A plus B equals C, right? Of this plus this is going to equal that. Of giving everybody rights, John Locke is going to make everybody happy and a utopian society will one day emerge, right? Didn't happen, okay? So irrationalists are going to actually push back on this positivist stuff a little bit, and they're going to be like, doesn't a lot of this depend on who's doing the experiment? the perceived outcomes, their hypothesis and what they're seeking, right? So this is sometimes referred to as modernist thinking, right? The clashing together of positivism and irrationalism, the competing forces of these two, are sometimes referred to as modernist thinking, because what's going to happen is a lot of thinkers are going to jump out of this time period, whether they be a rationalist or positivist or a completely new thing all their own, Sigmund Freud, like it's going to lead to this concept known as modernist thinking, where science has developed enough to prove a lot of things, but not everything necessarily, and that's where your irrationalists come into play. Now, my favorite irrationalist to talk about is this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche, right? Who is going to really send some shock waves through like philosophy and philosophical understanding throughout European history for centuries, if not eons, if not even in the modern era. Even though he's gonna go crazy later in life, and a lot of the things apparently he said when he was in an asylum or a sanatorium were written down by his sister, and a lot of it was really racist and screwed up. You do have to understand he still sent shockwaves through things, all right? So now, going into it, Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, is going to be a German philosopher, all right? He's going to show up during the unification process and the post-unification process, and he's going to have a lot of really, really key ideas that are going to be really important, right? For example, he believes that humans don't govern themselves by reason, right? He thinks that positivists are getting one thing wrong, that humans are all rational. He's like, no, they're irrational, right? Like your day, your mood, your wants, your needs, they change from moment to moment, from day to day. So he believes that you're governed more by emotion and passion, right? And he thinks that true knowledge and creativity is stifled by faith in Christianity. He is one of the very first adamant atheists that has ever existed, okay? So this is really big. He has a very famous quote that says, God is dead and man has killed him, right? So that's a really big moment in the progression of society, is when he says that. And basically what he's saying is that, like, we have now gone so far scientifically that we have basically disproven the existence of God. Now look, as a Catholic educator, I'm not saying that, I'm telling you what he said, all right? So now look, but he also goes into that perspective. It's a very, very big moment in society, because he basically actually says that how can we know anything at all, right? Which leads to this concept known as nihilism, right? So now nihilism is going to be something that kind of has its roots inside of Nietzsche's perspectives of that true knowledge and creativity are just stifled by faith, and that also humans are governed by impulse and passion, right? And so he creates this concept known as nihilism, right? And nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated for sure, right? So he basically attributes a lot of ideas that even this moment that you're learning, right, is not necessarily an important one, that it's only important to you, right? And it's only important to you and your perspective, and that it's not going to necessarily lead to anything, and that everything is not interconnected, and that we're basically floating balls of nothingness roaming around the universe on a big rock that's just flying around. He also believed as well that time is probably repetitive, and that we're probably doomed to make the same mistakes and eat our tail like an Ouroboros for the rest of eternity, right? So that is a really big moment in irrationalist thinking that Henri Bergson, another French irrationalist, jumps onto as well, who is a French scientist, and he believes that science is good, right? He's a little bit more of a diet Nietzsche, right? He comes in, he's like, science is good. However, humans interpret and shape it to their own reality. So it's all subjective, right? So he actually brought in a concept called relativism, right? He believes that all things are relative to their observer, right? That scientists, even on their own, are experiencing things in a certain concrete set of standards and a certain concrete set of moments. So it's going to lead them to having different objective results than other ones may have, right? So he actually believed that the world is relative to the observer, not necessarily any universal truth can be known, which is a pretty wild concept when you think about it. And this is then going to be applied to a very other important person, a man by the name of Sigmund Freud, all right? So Sigmund Freud, for those of you who might have heard of him before, very famous in psychology, right? So he basically takes up irrationalism and positivism, and he kind of blends the two of them together. And as a modernist psychologist, he shows up and believes that humans do not make rational decisions. He says they make emotional decisions based on their subconscious, and your subconscious lives inside of childhood repressions, right? He thinks that your subconscious, the things that you don't actively necessarily think about, manifest themselves in your decisions because you don't necessarily know why you do anything, you just do it. And the only way you can understand why you do it is from deep psychoanalysis, and that a lot of it is rooted in your childhood experiences, right? And that your daily decisions are governed by three key forces in your psyche, right? And those key forces include your id, your ego, and your superego, right? And basically what those functions are is your ego is you. This is my ego. My ego is this perspective that I am putting out into the world, right? It is the great mediator between the two forces that pull and tug at me, right? The id, according to Freud, is the devil on your shoulder. It's the primal one. It's the aggressive one. It's the one that's like, oh, I want a cheeseburger, I'm going to steal one. So like, no, it's that kind of thing, right? Your super ego, on the other hand, is the thing that you have been taught from childhood of what is morality, what is good, what is bad. Lying is bad, deception is bad, this is bad. And that these two forces fight with each other, and that your ego in the middle decides to mediate between how much of each you want to use in real life, right? And he believes through guided therapy and psychoanalysis, a person could be made to understand their subconscious, right? And psychoanalysis is actually putting you in a comfortable setting and trying to go through like analysis of your dreams and understanding of therapy and trying to actually unload a lot of stuff and figure out why you do the things you do so you can actively try to be a different person in a way, right? And kind of not fight your subconscious, but actually live alongside of it. Now, weird ideas are going to later be proven wrong. We'll talk about those in class about like his Oedipus complex and stuff like that. But his work is going to advance this field of psychology tremendously, right? And last but not least, before we end this flip real quick, is there's also going to be a new thought on science that some of y'all have learned already, all right? Because Newton was right, but not always right, okay? Something that you have to understand is that positivists are going to realize that Newton's ideas and understandings of the thermodynamic world are not always going to be correct, right? And so, but not, because we have to understand is that like in thermodynamics, there is a like equal but opposite reaction, and that the world is supposed to work in steady little predictable circumstances, right? You have to understand though that this guy, Max Planck, comes along and he actually disproves a lot of that. He's actually like, no. Atoms don't behave in this action-reaction form. They are actually very erratic, right? And they pulse different energies and different kind of like release energies and constant flows that change and force and pull back and forth. And he referred to those as quanta, right? Now, what that's going to do is it's going to lead to the idea of quantum mechanics and what atoms do when they are agitated versus when they are at neutral states. And that the movement and erratic nature of light in its wave and particle form can be changed, isolated, and then also definitely messed around with a little bit, which will then lead the ball rolling on theoretical physics, which leads to the big things of nuclear theory, and in the 1900s later on, nuclear energy and also nuclear bombs, right? So we'll talk more about Max Planck in class, but we're going to wrap it up right there, okay? And we're just basically talking about scientific understanding, and we're going to talk about imperialism in our next one. I'll see y'all soon.